All right. Welcome back to Dark Patterns. Let's go. I'm gonna check my audio real quick, and then let's get started. Looks good. Okay. Oh, and if I cut out randomly in the middle of this, my system crashed. Happened to me a couple times lately, so sorry about that. Hopefully it doesn't happen. All right. Today we're going to get into gamification. One of my favorite units, because it's one of my areas of research expertise, something I've been involved in personally for a number of years, is turning software into games, so a little bit of a disclosure of my bias there, but I won't tell you how I feel about that, just disclosing the fact that I've worked in it. Turning software into games is an interesting concept, but before we get into why it's a dark pattern and how it's manipulative, let's talk a little bit about games in general. What are games, and why are games so important to people? Why do games work on people at all? Maybe life is just one big game. But let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of games that there are. Well, there are games that we play against others, where we compete to be the best, or we compete to rank ourselves against other people. And some might argue that something like your workplace is a competitive game, or you're trying to get a higher role than other people. Some might argue that the classroom is a competitive game, where you're trying to get the highest grade. And some might argue that something like the classroom is a solo game. It's not competitive at all. You're actually just playing by yourself, and you only care about the score that you earn. So we have an idea of competitive games, but I think we also understand intuitively that not everything is the same level of competitive for everyone, that sometimes one person thinks a game is competitive when it really isn't. Everybody else is just playing solo, so to speak. And then we have cooperative games. Well, our society is kind of built on cooperative games. You could argue that things like government are just one big exercise in cooperative games of sort. You're trying to get people to, work together and listen to one another and agree to a common goal, and then, deliver on whatever it is that you're trying to do. So, maybe lots of things are actually cooperative games. And again, there's games that we play one-on-one against one other person. There's games that we play by ourselves. Everything from playing with a Rubik's Cube all the way up to whether or not you're going to do well in a particular class or something. That could be considered a solo game. Just like the Rubik's Cube can either be a solo game or a game that you play competitively against others to see how fast you can solve it. So again, it all depends on your perception, whether you're playing one-on-one, alone, or against a team, or with a team. And some games we play against the entire world. And again, it's a matter of your frame of reference, but if you think about something like your credit score, we all obviously have a score. Even if you don't know what it is, you have one, and you're playing it against everybody else in the United States. Every other adult also has a score. So is it a competitive game? Well, kind of. It's not like anybody gets props for having the highest credit score, but at the same time, your credit worthiness is determined by your relative credit worthiness against the rest of the population. So like it or not, and whether you agreed to play it or not, you are playing that game, and you will play it for the rest of your life against everybody else in this country, whether or not you are more or less credit worthy than your peers is a game that you essentially have to play. You could think of something like your salary as a game that you're playing against other people. Again, it all depends on your frame of reference. But one thing's for sure, it's that people love games, and this is actually not just true of people. It's human nature, but it's also mammal nature, and not even just mammals. It's all kinds of different animal nature. Even non-mammals play games. Some birds play games with each other. Some sea creatures play games with each other. Things like octopi. Primates are really big on games. Primates are probably the most game-playing kind of creature on Earth, so it makes sense that humans, being the most intelligent primate, are the most game-playing creature on Earth. Now, most animals, when they play games, they play them competitively, but they don't play them competitively in the sense that they're trying to kill each other. If you've ever seen puppies or kittens fight, they're not trying to beat each other up, but they do fight, and they fight a lot. And there's rules and a nature to the game, and humans have very similar behaviors too. They fight each other when they're little, or at least some of them do. And if they don't physically fight, well, they compete in different ways. But most animals don't have a concept of cooperative games. So if you think about what it is to be human, or what it is to play more human-like games, well, cooperative things are only played by very high-level animals. So pack hunters like wolves and dolphins and what are those things called? Killer whales. Those guys have to cooperate in order to kill things and do their job. So they play cooperative games, and humans, well, we also have to cooperate, obviously, quite a bit. So we play cooperative games, but many animals don't. They just play the competitive kind. So if you want to think about it developmentally, you could say, well, actually, it's the cooperative games that are the advanced ones. Competitive gaming is something that's fundamental to a variety of animals, but the smarter you are, the more cooperative you have to be. But all right, why do so many animals play games? Why do we bother? Well, I think most people who study that sort of thing would agree that animals play games to learn skills. We play fight to learn how to real fight. We play mock games in order to learn the real skills that are fundamentally behind them. So a monkey might learn to climb a tree by pretending to climb a tree, and then eventually figuring out how to climb a tree. But only a small number of animals continue to play games into adulthood, especially against other adults. Well, maybe it's because once you're an adult and you've learned all the skills you've needed as an animal, you have no more need for games. But of course, humans are never done learning all the skills that we need. We need so many skills, and we always need more and more of them. So maybe that's a good explanation for why people will continue to play games well into adulthood. Most people play games their whole lives. I think pretty much everybody does. And although the amount of time we spend per day playing games definitely goes down for most people, we still spend a pretty big chunk of our lives playing some kind of game. With that, let's talk a little bit about Jean Piaget. Let's pronounce his name as Piaget to keep up our streak of mispronouncing all philosophers, even though he's not really a philosopher, he's really more of a psychologist. Now, he was born right at the beginning of the 1900s and lived, I think, something into his 80s. So he published a lot and did a lot of work and worked essentially his whole life. Started publishing in the 20s and didn't stop till he died in the 70s or 80s, whenever he died. He's best known for his theories on childhood development. In fact, his theories of childhood development are essentially the underpinning of all modern developmental psychology. Is still very popular today, although people have continued to build on top of them. And he was also an interesting philosopher. As a side note, before we get into what he thought about developmental psychology and play, he also had some publications on his philosophy, and a lot of it derived from what he thought about development and play. So something for you to think about, since a lot of our focus in this class is determining whether something is right or wrong, moral or immoral. Well, Piaget thought that children develop morals from their peers, which is really radical and not something people even think today. I think a lot of people would consider that radical today. Most people think that children develop morals from looking at their elders, from their parents, from role models in their life who are older. But Piaget thought the opposite. He thought that children develop their sense of morality, justice, equality, whether you think something is right or wrong, from your interactions with your peers. And your interactions with your peers that lead to those kinds of things are, of course, fundamentally game-driven. So you learn what's fair and just when you play games as a small child with other peers. And that shows you that, well, the people who play the game fairly that develops your sense of fairness. If you grow up in an environment where nobody plays fairly, it sort of forms your own sense of fairness to adjust to that. Piaget also thought that morality comes in stages, something that's been pretty well established today, although there's a lot of dispute about how young children have to be before they enter these different stages. It's pretty well known that children who are very little have no concept of the motive of other people when they judge an action. So for very small children, Piaget thought that about 10 years old was the start of the turn to something different, although today some people say as young as 4. But for very young children, only outcomes matter, and they don't have a concept of the motives of the other person. So only consequences of actions matter. And it doesn't matter if you meant not to push me. You pushed me, and I fell over, so you did something wrong. So the concept of an accident is a little bit foreign to little kids, although they kind of develop the sense of an accident pretty quick. Maybe before 10 is more appropriate for that. But they certainly don't ascribe things like, I meant to steal from you versus I took something from you on accident. In that case, they're probably only thinking of the consequences. Then around 10 and well into adulthood, consequences start to matter less and less, and motive starts to matter more and more. And so you see a lot of people, adult people, when they're discussing whether something is right or wrong, they tend to talk more about the motive of the person who committed the action. Did they mean to do that? And were they able to do something else, etc., and so forth. So in that sense, outcomes is a really primitive way to think of morality, and motives is the more advanced way, although there are still plenty of schools of philosophy that judge outcomes a lot more heavily than motive, and also plenty of schools that essentially disregard motive altogether. So it's not like this is, fundamental or true in any sense, just what one person thinks. Piaget said that play is the work of childhood. So your job when you're a kid, it's not to go to school and sit in a classroom and listen to an adult drone on and all the other stuff that you have to do when you're a kid. The main thing that you're occupied with as a child is playing, because games are what turn children into functional humans. And Piaget categorized essentially 4 stages of games that people play. From 0 to 2, they interact with the world, learn sensory skills. Cloth feels like this, leather feels like that. If I stick this in my mouth, it hurts. If I stick this in my mouth, it's delicious, and so on and so forth. Very small children just touch things and look at them and smack them and learn about the world by playing with them physically. And then from 2 to 7, children start to learn to communicate with one another, although they still don't play so much with each other as near each other until the end of that phase, when they finally start to develop some kind of games with one another, cooperation. But you're also learning to imagine at this age. You play games of imagination, make-believe, and fantasy. Then from 7 to 11, children start to develop logic. At this age, children are able to play with things like a Rubik's Cube or Legos and construct a structured planet from start to finish. So this is about the age where most software developers stop developing. Because, logic, building a software system and so forth, you could start to do that at 11. But you actually can't really build software until 11 and then on into adulthood, when you start to develop abstraction. So when you go beyond logic, at 7 to 11, you might be able to master the mechanics of a game like chess, but it takes the next stage of development for you to develop abstractions like strategy and planning ahead and the game within the game and so forth. So that marks the rest of our life, where we play games of developing abstraction. Here are some other types of games and the approximate age of children that play them according to Piaget. So the earliest games are functional. We play mostly physical games. We like peekaboo or knocking down a tower of blocks. We're not really interested in building a tower of blocks when we're very, very small, but we sure do like smashing it. When we move into becoming interested in building towers of blocks instead of smashing them, that puts us in a more constructive stage of games. Constructive games require you to accomplish goals and build things. I want to build a tower of blocks, or I want to build a car made out of Lego, although children at this age are really probably not capable of planning ahead something as complex as a car. Even though they want to be constructive, they don't have the abstract skills to make a whole car, but they might be able to make something that's a fantasy of a car and looks a little bit car-like, because there's overlap between this age group and the next one. Kids as young as 3 already start playing fantasy games too, where they role play and make believe, play dress up with their dolls or their G.I. Joes or whatever, pretend to be in war and pretend to be in the kitchen and whatever else the heck kids do. Then from age 7 to adulthood, these are the games that are played by, well, I guess they're what we would consider to be actual games, things like board games and video games. Once you're old enough to understand rules, and then what comes with rules is often the concept of winners and losers, you can start playing games that actually have rules to them, and you can actually follow the rules. And when you're playing games that have rules to them, you're almost certainly playing them with others, which means that you learn things like breaking rules has consequences, and you learn things like cooperation, either cooperation to make sure everybody's following the rules, or cooperation in the form of playing as a team, and competition, again, competition within a ruled structure. That brings us to Lev Vygotsky, whose name is easy to mispronounce. He was a Soviet scientist. He was actually from Belarus, which is not Russia. It's now a country. But at the time, it was just the Soviet Union. And, well, when he was working. I actually don't think it was when he was born. But anyway, he was born in 1986, which is around the same time as Piaget, but he died much younger. He died in his 30s, or Piaget lived into his 80s or whatever. So he actually never really finished his work. Other people picked it up after him. And if you've ever heard of the zone of proximal development, that's his magnum opus. It's still a very popular concept today. That's the concept that the best time to teach somebody something is when they're not quite able to do it themselves, but they don't quite need you to hold their hand through the whole process. It's when somebody can be shown how to do something with relatively little guidance and then be able to do it themselves. That's the best time for people to learn something. So it's a popular concept in education, computer science education, that it's best to introduce people to concepts when you can gently guide them towards doing them almost by themselves, rather than showing them those concepts when they're already fully capable of doing them by themselves. Then it's too late and the learning isn't optimal, versus also introducing those concepts when people need you to hold their hand the whole way through. Then it's also too late or too early, and they're not going to really understand any of it. So this marks things like what is too early to teach children the ABCs and things like that. It continues to be a part of debates around education. But Vygotsky was also known for his work on play. Here's a quote from him. "In play, a child is always above his average age, above his daily behavior. In play, it's as though he were a head taller than himself." So that means that kids play games where they're pretending to be the next stage of development, just beyond where they're at. So if a kid is not quite capable of, let's say, playing soccer, they will play and kind of pretend to play soccer. And then eventually, through play, they will learn to play soccer. So it's actually games that transition us into our next stage of development. Some more examples. Toddlers eventually develop impulse control. Vygotsky would argue that they learn impulse control by playing make-believe games. And in fact, make-believe games, if you think about it, are kind of a form of wish fulfillment. They're a way to have your impulses satisfied without actually satisfying them. For example, if you have a desire to drive a car, well, if you're 3, you don't have a car and you definitely can't drive, but you can definitely pretend to drive a car, and that, when you're 3 years old, gives you enough satisfaction to not need to drive a real one. And likewise, with many make-believe games, you can appease yourself and satisfy yourself without actually having to have the real thing, and it lets you be content with not having stuff, which is a big part of impulse control. Another example might be teenagers learning to plan ahead. Again, once you get past that age of 11 or so, and you have to learn abstraction and foresight and that kind of thing, well, you could learn that through games like chess or other strategic and planning-oriented games. And of course, kids of all ages learn cooperation and teamwork and all that good stuff through sports, which is why many people consider sports to be so valuable. And let's bring it back to software now. We've talked enough about games. So we've established that human beings have a pretty strong preference to play games. We're configured to play games. We do it from childhood, and unlike many other animals, we continue to do it into adulthood. We are very well configured to play games. When we see a game, we play it instinctively, and when we're bored, we do very strange stuff, like trying not to step on the cracks in the sidewalk for our own amusement. We just make up games as we go along. Different people have various levels of preference for this, so if you found that previous example to be pretty foreign because you think that that's kind of dumb, then you probably don't have a very strong preference for playing games. But if you found the previous example very familiar indeed, and you also find yourself avoiding the cracks in the sidewalk or trying to step only on the bricks of a certain color or whatever other stupid games we make up for ourselves on a day-to-day basis, then you probably have a stronger preference for playing games. Which brings us to the first dark pattern that we're going to look at, the illusion of progress. The illusion of progress works like this. You make the user feel like they're earning something, some kind of score, some kind of progression, something that goes up as they participate in your product. And people will just do what you ask to earn more of this useless participation score. It doesn't matter that it's meaningless and worth nothing. We're compelled to play games, so we see a score and we want to earn it. We want to earn points in it. We're also compelled to win or finish games that we start. So if the score takes the form of a progress bar instead, if we see something like you're currently 25% of the way done, or even worse, you're currently 98% of the way done, finish the last 2% and you'll be done. Well, we feel compelled to get that last 2%. Some people also call this completing the set or completing the collection. There's no canonical book or anything on dark patterns. There's no great name for it. I call it the illusion of progress, but you're free to call it whatever you want. Here are some examples. This is one of my favorites from LinkedIn. It still has it to this day, although the format is a lot different. You have a completion bar for your profile completeness, and it shows you the steps that you need to take to earn more score, to get closer to finished. So it's encouraging you to complete the set, get to 100%. It's encouraging you to rank up. But the kinds of stuff that they're asking you to do is very valuable to LinkedIn. You're providing them information that greatly improves the value of their social network. They want your picture, for example. Well, that's pretty personal information. They want to know where you went to school. They want to know where you currently work. These are really important data points for anybody who's interested in data about different people. So of course LinkedIn is really interested in getting this stuff from you, and the way they get it is by phrasing it in the form of a game. If you give this stuff to us, well, then you get scored. Most people, without this kind of menu, without this kind of encouragement, probably wouldn't fill out all the different sections. I mean, we might fill out the position and education and the picture if we're looking for a job, but it's unlikely that we would visit some arcane part of LinkedIn, like ask for a recommendation. I don't remember anybody ever using that feature of LinkedIn. I don't even know if it still exists. Adding your specialties. We might not have engaged with these parts of the platform if it didn't satisfy our need to complete the progress bar, if it didn't satisfy our desire to earn more score. And then LinkedIn also shows you one of these bubbles depending on where your status is at. I think today it's a bar instead of a bubble, but it shows you, oh, your profile's really not finished. It's beginner. This corresponds, by the way, to the same kind of thing, the profile completeness. So your profile's really not finished. You're a beginner. It's red. That's bad. Yellow, that's a little better, but you could really do better. You could be green, or you could be blue. Or the bubble could be full, but the bubble's never quite full, is it? Because we always want people to come back and earn a little bit more score. Windows likes to do this all the goddamn time. Let's finish setting up your device. Let's finish it. We need to be done with the setup. It's not that something is missing here. You probably don't really care about any of these features, but man, you sure would like to finish, wouldn't you? Of course, skip for now is also very subtle. It's in the bottom left corner here. It's not exactly easy to see. So most people think, well, let's finish. All right, fine, continue. Let's finish. And so this window is definitely a great example of encouraging people through their compulsion to be done, to finish, to complete sets that have pieces missing from them. And of course, again, these things are very valuable to Microsoft. Linking your devices, getting a subscription, activating OneDrive, all stuff that Microsoft would really like you to do because it adds a lot of value to them. There are also many different social media platforms that have some kind of badge or score component. Stack Overflow is a great example. You can earn all these lovely badges. Look at this great collection of fascinating badges, and look at this reputation, and oh boy, my graph looks so nice. I've got all these points, and I got way more points in February, and I'm doing awesome, but oh, it flatlined. I gotta step my game up and get more points, and if I just keep going, I'll get a badge, and then I can add it to my badge collection of badges. And look, I'm in the top 8%. That's great, but I could be in the top 1 or the top 2 or whatever if I just participate more, and so on and so forth. Reddit karma's the same way. It's just imaginary points, but the more you participate, the more points you get. And if you participate really well, you'll get awards and you get badges, and there's different kinds of badges, and it's wonderful. Points, points, points. And here's some random mobile game too as an example from the games industry. Well, of course, we expect games to have the illusion of progress. That's the whole point of the game. We're not talking about that. But here we have a login reward. Every day we open the game, we get some random trinket. Isn't that lovely? So it has nothing to do with the game. It's just a login reward you get for coming in every day. But every day you come in, it's a progress bar that fills up more and more. And if you miss a day, then you'll never finish it. Never get to 31. So of course you have to sign in every day or you won't complete the set. So today's discussion is whether or not turning your not game software, big caveat there, not game software, into a game of progress. So if you think that turning your software into a game where there's an illusion of progress is perfectly fine, then you're on the moral side. And if you think that turning your software into an illusion of progress is wrong, the user should be able to choose what kind of stuff on your software platform they want to participate in without being subjected to this illusion of progress prompt like LinkedIn has. If you think that's wrong, then you'd be on the immoral side. And again, both sides exclude actual games. We understand that actual games are not real progress. You don't earn anything in real life by leveling up in World of Warcraft, but you do actually level up in World of Warcraft, and it does mean something in the context of the game that you're playing, and it is also the whole point of that experience. So, of course, we're pretty happy to deal with that illusion of progress. So unless you are kind of against the concept of games in general, don't talk about that. Talk about stuff that's not games and whether or not that should give you the illusion of progress or not. And of course, if you're on the immoral side, then it depends on what it is that the software is trying to encourage you to do. Maybe you think that certain things, it's okay to give people an illusion of progress, and certain things, it's not. All right, I'll see you in Discord for the discussion.